I knew something was wrong the moment my key slid into the lock and stopped like it had hit bone. No give. No familiar click. Just a stubborn stillness that told me it was over before I even understood what ending I had walked into. I tried again, slower this time, as if the house might change its mind. But the lock was new, and the metal felt colder than the air around me. When I stepped back, I noticed the suitcase on the porch. My suitcase, packed neatly, the handle extended, a name tag tied to it with a crisp ribbon, like someone had prepared it earlier and waited for me to come home after my 12-hour ICU shift so they could finish whatever story they had started writing without me. For a moment, I just stood there on the porch, feeling the December air in Charlotte press against my shoulders. Dilworth is usually quiet at that hour, and the street looked normal, almost peaceful. Porch lights glowing, a dog barking 2 houses down. The kind of night where people were settling in with leftover dinner and television. Reruns. I set my hand on the railing, steadying myself before knocking. It sounded louder than I expected, echoing across the porch and bouncing off the neighbor's oak tree. The door opened almost immediately. My dad stood there, blocking the entry with his body. My mom was half a step behind him, her arms folded tight, eyes dry, face unreadable. My dad's voice came out low and firm. Leave the house key. Take your suitcase and get out. I thought maybe I had misheard him. There was a moment where my brain simply refused to deliver the sentence. My dad had spoken plenty of harsh things over the years, but this one felt different. It felt rehearsed. My mom didn't soften it, didn't contradict it. She simply added that your brother needs the room. I heard movement behind them, and then my 22-year-old brother appeared, leaning against the hallway wall, with a grin like this was an inside joke he had been waiting to tell. I opened my mouth, not sure if a question or a breath would come out. Instead, I said the only thing that made sense at that moment. I have put almost $96,000 into this house over the last 4 years. Mortgage payments, repairs, medication, bills, everything. My mom's eyes did not shift. That was rent. You are not blood. It was such a clean cut. The kind you feel before you understand you are bleeding. I looked down at my hand still resting on the porch railing. For some reason, I noticed how steady it was. No shaking. I had pictured myself shaking in a moment like this, but there I was, surprisingly calm. Fingers curled around cold metal, while the warmth inside my own home did not belong to me anymore. My brother laughed quietly behind them, and that sound, that little exhale of amusement, hit harder than my dad's words. I felt something hollow out behind my ribs. I had returned home expecting a shower, a late dinner, maybe 6 hours of sleep before my next shift. Instead, I was standing in the dark holding a key that no longer matched the lock it was made for. Before I go any further, let me pause for a moment. I always like knowing what people are doing when they listen to stories like this. It makes the world feel a little closer, a little more human. So if you feel like it, share it in the comments later. When all of this happened, I was standing on that porch still in my scrubs, the smell of sanitizer on my sleeves, realizing in real time that whatever family I thought I still had was already gone. I stepped back, not trusting my voice enough to speak. The porch light glared against the silver of the key in my hand, and for a second I just stared at it, remembering all the nights I had rushed through that door after double shifts, all the mornings I had slipped out quietly so I would not wake anyone. My dad waited for me to say something, maybe to argue so he could win again. My mom looked past me like she was already erasing the shape of my body from the world. Doorway. I bent down and set the key gently on the brick step because throwing it would have felt too dramatic, and crying would have given them something to gossip about tomorrow. My brother muttered something like, "Good girl," but I did not turn back to look at him. The strangest part was the laughter inside, not loud, but present, drifting from the living room where the television was on. Hearing it felt like watching someone else's life through a window, a life where I had never belonged, no matter how much money I had poured into keeping the place standing. My hand brushed the handle of the suitcase, and the absurdity of it nearly made me laugh. It was packed as if I were going on a vacation. Folded clothes, toiletries zipped neatly, a sweater I had not worn since last winter. They had taken their time. They had made choices. They had sorted my things like I was a tenant whose lease had expired. I walked down the steps slowly, each footstep dull against the concrete. I could hear my dad close the door behind me, Not harshly, not slamming it, just a quiet click that sounded like a final decision. I lifted the suitcase into the trunk of my car. The weight surprised me. Maybe I had expected it to be lighter, symbolic even. But it felt heavy, the way a life feels heavy when someone else packs it for you. I stood there with my hand on the trunk for a few seconds, breathing in slow, steady breaths. As I drove down the quiet street, something inside me settled in a way I didn't expect. Not relief exactly, but clarity. A cold, clean line drawn through the center of everything I had believed about loyalty and obligation and blood. They had not just kicked me out. They had rewritten the story of who I was allowed to be. They had taken the role of daughter and handed it to someone else without hesitation. Something in me hardened, not in anger, but recognition. If a family could be dismantled that quickly, maybe it had never been mine to begin with. I turned onto East Boulevard, the road empty except for a few cars heading toward Uptown. The soft hum of the tires on asphalt steadied me far more than any apology ever could have. I realized that whatever came next would not be about getting back inside that house. What came next would be about truth, about the quiet, methodical way I learned to build things that last. I am an ICU nurse. I know how to keep people alive. I also know how to let go when nothing healthy is left to save. I drove into the night, the suitcase thumping gently in the trunk as if reminding me that this was real, that my life had just changed shape. I didn't know then how far things would go, or what lines would be crossed, or what pieces of the past I would dig up because of that single sentence spoken at the one doorway. All I knew was that I had been pushed out. And when people like me get pushed out, we do not disappear. We take notes. When I finally glanced at the rearview mirror, the streetlights behind me blurred into a soft ribbon of gold. Charlotte looked peaceful from that angle. Quiet. Unaware. It struck me then that this moment, the one I never saw coming, would become the beginning of everything that followed. This was not just the night I was pushed out. It was the night I understood that I had been standing on borrowed ground for far too long. I kept driving until the lights thinned out and the highway turned into a darker, emptier ribbon across the edge of Charlotte. At some point, the city fell behind me completely. I did not notice when. I only realized it once the silence in the car grew louder than the hum of the engine. I pulled into the parking lot of a 24-hour grocery store, the kind with bright lights and only 3 cars out front. My hands felt too heavy on the steering wheel. I shut off the engine and everything inside me seemed to drop into that same stillness. I leaned back in the seat and finally let myself stop. But as soon as my breathing slowed, the darkness behind my eyelids changed shape. It slid backward, deeper, until I was standing in a different place entirely. I was 8 years old again, too small for the black shoes someone had put me in that morning, standing on a carpet that smelled like lilies and furniture polish. The funeral home in Asheville was cold in that over-air-conditioned way that made adults shiver and whisper that someone needed to turn down the thermostat. I remember staring at the closed casket, trying to imagine my mom inside it. The mom who had brushed my hair that morning of the accident and promised we would go to the park later. Someone had told me she looked peaceful. I refused to look. Peace did not belong to that moment. My legs were shaking so hard even then that I thought everyone could hear them, tapping against each other. A woman's voice behind me kept repeating she is in a better place, and I kept thinking that a better place should include 8-year-old daughters who needed their mothers. I did not cry until someone touched my shoulder. When I turned, I saw the woman who would become my mom. Not yet, not officially, but her face had a softness that pulled something loose inside me. She crouched down so we were eye level. She said, "You will always be my daughter." Her voice was steady, not trembling like the others. And for the first time that day, I felt anchored to something. My dad stood nearby, watching both of us with a look that felt like a promise I did not fully understand. Later that afternoon, he signed the papers that made me part of their family. I remember the pen gliding across the document and thinking it sounded like a door opening. The early years with them were warm in the ways that matter to a child. Hot chocolate on snow days. My mom rubbed Vicks on my chest when I had a cold. My dad let me ride on the lawnmower with him, both of us pretending it was some kind of boat cutting through tall green waves. I learned quickly that if I was helpful, if I stayed quiet when they were tired, if I followed the rules without question, their smiles lasted longer. I became good at earning affection the way other kids earned allowance. I washed dishes. I folded towels. I made perfect grades because praise felt like proof I deserved to stay. Even as a child, I understood that love could be conditional, not because they said it, but because I felt it in the small pauses between moments. When I forgot a chore. When I asked for something that cost too much. When I needed more attention than they had energy to give. None of it was cruel. It was simply the kind of love that had to be maintained. And so I maintained it with the desperation of someone who believed she could be returned if she made one wrong move. As I got older, the responsibilities changed, but the pattern stayed. At 15, I cooked dinner when my mom was sick. At 17, I picked up a part-time job to cover my own school supplies. At 19, I was already talking about nursing programs. My dad liked that idea. He said, family helps family, and the world needs good nurses, and both lines felt like gospel to me. I clung to them, believing they were the backbone of the life they had given me. Choosing ICU work seemed natural. I was good at handling emergencies. I could stay calm while other people panicked. I liked the precision of it, the quick thinking, the focus required to keep someone alive when everything was falling apart. I learned to read monitors like a second language. I learned how to speak to families in crisis, how to interpret silence, how to stand steady while the ground shook beneath someone else's feet. I understood suffering, not because I had lived a dramatic life, but because I had spent years learning how to carry pain without letting it spill over. Somewhere along the way, my family began depending on me in ways that felt both ordinary and permanent. If the water heater broke, I paid for it. If my mom needed new medication, I drove her to the pharmacy. If my dad needed a repair on the house, I wrote the check without being asked. It never occurred to me to question it. Family helps family. The phrase became so familiar that it felt like a rule carved into the kitchen wall. I told myself it was proof that I belonged, that I was needed, that I was essential in a way no one else could be. For 24 years, I lived inside that belief. I built my life around it. I worked extra shifts when the mortgage was behind. I canceled vacations to cover their bills. I ignored the sinking feeling in my stomach every time gratitude turned into expectation. It was easier to be indispensable than to wonder if I was loved. I never asked myself why I worked so hard to maintain a place I was told I had been given freely. I never asked why the words, "You will always be my daughter," felt more like a contract than a promise. For a moment, I could not remember where I was or what time it was. Then it came back in a slow wave. The porch. The suitcase, the key on the brick step glowing under the glare of the porch light, my dad's voice telling me to leave. My mom said I was not blood. For 24 years, I existed in that house because I believed being useful was the same as being wanted. I believed that if I filled enough gaps, paid enough bills, and carried enough weight, I could secure my place in the story. But families do not keep you because you are useful. They keep you because you are theirs. And tonight, my mom had said the words that confirmed what I had always feared. I was not theirs, not in the way that mattered. I let the thought sit there, sharp as glass. I had spent my entire childhood terrified of being returned, and I had spent my adulthood convincing myself that fear was irrational. Yet here I was, at 32, sleeping in my car in the parking lot of a grocery store because the people who once promised to keep me had decided my place was no longer worth the space it took up. They had taken back the narrative. They had rewritten my role without hesitation. The strange thing was that beneath the hurt, beneath the betrayal, there was a sliver of something else. Something I did not have a name for yet. Maybe it was clarity, or maybe it was the beginning of letting go of a belief that had shaped my entire life. I did not know, but I felt it, quiet and insistent, waiting for me to acknowledge it. I let that thought rest as the parking lot grew quieter, the cold creeping through the windows. I adjusted my jacket, pulled my knees closer to my chest, and allowed the darkness to settle around me again. Tomorrow would force me to move. Tonight I could at least breathe in the truth of what had changed. They had taken me in once. They had let me go now. The part I had not yet figured out was who I was supposed to be without them. By the time my body felt stiff, and my mind felt sharper than it should have after barely resting. There was a surprising clarity in that fatigue, almost like my brain had decided to work on autopilot. The first thought that surfaced was a simple one. I needed to know exactly how much I had given that house. Not in sentiment or years or sacrifices. In dollars. In numbers that could not be rewritten with a simple, "You are not blood." I unlocked my phone and watched the screen brighten slowly. My eyes adjusted. Notifications filled the top of the display, none of them urgent. I opened the banking app and scrolled through the last 4 years. It was like reading a diary written entirely in transactions. Every transfer carried a memory, a justification, a conversation I had convinced myself was normal. I started counting. The roof repair came first. $18,000. My dad had called me while I was at work. There was a leak in the attic. He sounded annoyed. Like the house had betrayed him somehow. Like the ceiling had cracked out of spite. He said he had gotten a quote and it needed to be fixed immediately before the damage spread. I remember nodding, even though he could not see me, and saying I would take care of it. That phrase had become as natural as breathing. I will take care of it. I transferred the money before my lunch break ended. I found the receipt in my camera roll, a blurred picture of the invoice he insisted I keep for my records. At the time, it felt responsible. Looking at it now, it felt like the first page in a book I should have closed much earlier. Next was my mom's medication. Monthly costs that varied, sometimes $200. Sometimes $400. Sometimes more when she needed the brand name version because the generic made her feel dizzy. She always apologized for the price. Then she would add that the stress of calculating the bills aggravated her symptoms, and my instinct to protect her rose before I ever questioned whether the math made sense. I had years of text messages that read the same way. Mom said, "Can you cover this month?" and me replying, "Of course." No hesitation, no limit. Reading them now felt like watching someone else's generosity being taken for, granted in slow motion. Then there was the car. My brother's car. That one had started with an emergency. At least, that was how it was presented. My brother had taken a job 2 towns over, and his old car finally died. He stood in the kitchen, looking defeated in a way meant to draw sympathy. My dad said he needs something reliable or he will lose his job. We do not want him to fall behind again. My mom added he has been trying so hard. I remember standing there thinking I had the means to help, and that helping felt like the right thing to do. I am embarrassed to admit how proud I was at that moment. I thought I was investing in his future. I thought I was supporting the family that had supported me. I signed for the down payment that afternoon. The total came to $7,000. He thanked me once. A short text that read, "Thank you, sis." No period, no follow-up. I told myself gratitude looked different for everyone, but the largest piece, the one that sat like a stone in the center of everything, was the surgery. $34,000. My dad told me his chest pain had worsened and that he had been referred to a cardiologist. He described the symptoms in alarming detail, and my training kicked in. I asked the right questions, the clinical ones, the ones he would not expect me to know. He hesitated a little when I pressed him, but he blamed the medication for making him forgetful. He said the procedure needed to be scheduled quickly because the doctor was worried. My mom chimed in to say they had been so scared. She said it softly, like a confession. I did not question any of it. I transferred the money the next morning, telling myself that if anything happened to him and I had hesitated, I would never forgive myself. As I sat in the car scrolling through those transactions, the totals began forming in my mind. $18,000 for the roof, $34,000 for the surgery, $7,000 for the car, thousands more in medications, countless smaller payments for utilities, groceries, repairs. $96,000. I whispered the number out loud to hear how it sounded in the air. $96,000. Hearing it made my chest tighten. Not in sadness, but in recognition. That number represented 4 years of trust. 4 years of believing I was doing the right thing. 4 years of thinking money could secure a place in a family. I opened a folder of old text messages from my dad. His tone in those messages had always carried authority. Not aggressive, but assured. Almost paternal, in a way that assumed compliance. There were lines like, "It needs to be handled today," and "We will pay you back next month, and this is important for the family." I had read those messages with trust. Now I read them with a kind of detached clarity. The casual expectation, the implicit pressure, the way the word family was used like a key I was supposed to hold on to, even if the lock kept changing shape. I picked the phone back up and opened the mortgage account. The app took a moment to load. When it finally did, my eyes scanned the payment history out of habit. My stomach tightened. A few of the months were marked as overdue, small red flags next to the dates. I blinked, thinking I might be reading it wrong. I scrolled again. Then again. The pattern held. Payment I had made had not been applied to the mortgage. Not all of them, but enough to stand out, and enough to unsettle something deep inside me. I checked my bank transfers to confirm. The outgoing payments were there, documented, on time, consistent. I had sent the money. The mortgage account had not received it. Or rather, it had not been applied to what I believed it was. A cold awareness began to climb up my spine. Not fear, not anger, something quieter but far more dangerous. The realization that the narrative I had been fed might not be the truth. That the trust I had extended unquestioningly might have been misplaced. That the numbers did not match the story. My pulse steadied instead of racing. My training as a nurse has always handled shock in this strange way. When something alarming happens, my mind becomes sharper, calmer. There is a separation that occurs, like stepping back from the edge of a cliff to see the whole landscape. That is what this felt like. I was beginning to see the shape of something I had ignored for too long. I scrolled back through messages with my mom. There were dozens of requests, little ones at first, then bigger ones. A payment here, a bill there, each one framed as temporary, as necessary, as part of being a family. I had given freely because I assumed honesty, because I assumed we shared the same values, because I believed I was helping them stay afloat in a difficult world. But $96,000 is not a small sum, and overdue mortgage notices do not materialize by accident. The first step was a text to my mom. I typed that I needed space and would be staying away for a while. No accusation, no anger, no request for explanation. Just a simple statement. I need some time. She replied almost instantly. Okay, rest. We all need a little time. Then a second message that read, Hope you understand. We did what we had to do. There was a finality in that sentence that stung more than the night before. I stared at the screen for a long minute before locking the phone again. My dad did not respond at all. Silence from him had always been louder than any words. I stayed in the parking lot another hour, gathering enough strength to move. When I finally drove off, it was not toward work or a friend's house. It was toward a small diner near South Boulevard that opened early. I needed coffee, something bitter and grounding, and a booth where no one knew me. I slid into a corner spot, ordered black coffee and a plain toasted bagel, and opened my phone again. If I could not sleep, I could at least organize what I knew. For years, I had saved everything out of habit. Screenshots of receipts, forwarded confirmation emails, PDF bills neatly filed under categories like repairs and medical, and utilities. I told myself it was because I liked being prepared. The truth was that being adopted at 8 had taught me to document things, to keep proof of belonging, to create order where uncertainty once lived. Now that habit might finally serve a purpose I had never imagined. I opened my email and began forwarding documents to a new folder labeled House. Every repair invoice, every utility bill I had covered, every credit card payment I had made on their behalf. I scrolled through messages from my dad, dragging each one into another folder, reading his tone more closely than I ever had before. At the time, they seemed like reasonable requests. Family helps family. We will pay you back. This is temporary. Looking at them now, the wording felt deliberate, polished, almost practiced. There was only one person I trusted to help me sort through facts without making me feel foolish. His name was Mark, and he had been a year behind me in high school. We became close when he joined the pre-med club, and I had been the one tutoring him in biology. He used to say I had the brain of a surgeon, even though I chose nursing. We lost touch after graduation, but reconnected briefly during the pandemic when he became an insurance investigator for a private firm. He handled claim reviews, fraud detection, and medical case audits. We'd exchanged maybe 10 messages in the last 3 years, but I knew he would answer if I called. I stared at his name on the screen for a long moment before pressing the call button. My voice felt tight when he picked up, his tone groggy like I had woken him. I apologized quickly and said I needed help with something. He heard something in my voice that made him sit up. I could tell by the shift in his breathing. He asked what was going on. I told him the condensed version, the kind of stripped-down version an ICU nurse gives during a code. The facts only. I came home. The locks were changed. They kicked me out. I started reviewing my finances. Something feels wrong. I think I need your help. He did not ask why my family would do that. He did not ask the emotional questions most people would have pushed into the conversation. Instead, he asked for numbers, dates, transaction histories, whether anything had seemed unusual before last night. I told him about the roof repair, the car payment, the medications, the mortgage issues. When I reached the part about my dad's heart procedure, he went quiet for a few seconds. Then he asked if I had ever seen the claim paperwork. I told him no, that I had transferred the money directly because my dad said the hospital required immediate payment. Another long pause filled the line. He said he needed me to call the insurance company to ask for the claim number. I explained that it was not my policy, and he said that did not matter. I could ask for verification of payment under my own transferred funds. He guided me through the exact phrasing. I wrote it down on a napkin with a borrowed pen from the waitress. He said it calmly, like he had said it 100 times before. Then he asked me to send every document I had, including the timestamps of the messages with my dad and mom. He said he would take a preliminary look within a day. The relief I expected to feel did not come. Instead, I felt a strange mix of numbness and dread. Asking for help always made me uncomfortable. Even as a child, I had learned to solve things alone. I thanked him and told him I would send everything shortly. Before we hung up, he asked one more question. Did I feel safe? I answered yes, too quickly. He repeated the question more slowly. I took a breath and said I was fine. We both knew I was giving him a professional answer, not a truthful one, but he let it go. I paid my bill and stepped outside. The morning had warmed slightly, but the air still held a crispness that reminded me it was winter. I walked to my car and paused when I saw a message alert pop up on my phone. It was from one of the women in my mom's neighborhood group. She wrote a short note that said something like, "Sorry about everything, and hope you find a place to stay." Then added a line that felt like a bruise. Your mom said you had been distant for a while and that she hoped you would learn. Gratitude. I stood still, letting the words sink in. It did not surprise me that my mom had shaped her own version of the story for them. Neighborhood. She had always cared about appearances, about being seen as the one who sacrificed the most. It also did not surprise me that people believed her. I had always been the quiet one, the dependable one, the one who rarely spoke unless asked. It was easy to paint me as ungrateful, easy to pull sympathy towards someone who cried easily and told stories with. Practiced vulnerability. I opened a second message from a neighbor who wrote, "Sorry it turned out this way, but maybe some distance will help you grow up." I exhaled, not in anger, but in recognition. The community around my parents had always seen me as the outsider, the adopted one, the helper. The one who did not have the same roots. My contributions had been invisible to them. They saw the surface. My mom's soft voice. My dad's steady presence. My brother's charm. They did not see the ledger underneath. I opened the email draft I had created earlier and began attaching documents. Receipts, transfers, photo evidence, everything that held weight. I organized them by year, then by category. It felt procedural, like assembling a patient file before handing it to a doctor. When I finished, I hesitated over the send button for a long moment. Then I pressed it. As I slid into the driver's seat again, the phone buzzed. A single incoming message from Mark. He wrote 2 sentences. Got the files. Starting review now. Then another line appeared. Are you sure your dad ever had heart surgery? The question held so much weight that the world seemed to still for a moment. I stared at the screen until the letters blurred slightly. The question was simple. The implication was not. I set the phone down and gripped the steering wheel, my mind suddenly wide awake. Something cold and clear settled into place, the kind of clarity that comes before an unfolding truth. I had spent years believing in their version of things. Now I had to decide whether I was finally ready to see mine. And for the first time, I felt the ground shift under my feet in a way that told me the story I thought knew was about to break open. The question sat on my phone like a weight I could not ignore. I drove to a nearby park, the kind with a small lake and wooden benches that looked sturdier than they actually were, and parked facing the water. It was quiet. Too quiet for how loud my thoughts had become. I read the message again. Are you sure your dad ever had heart surgery? I should have answered immediately. Something simple like, of course he did. Or, I was there when he said he needed it. But the truth was that I could not form any response at all. Not yet. I sat there for several minutes before the phone buzzed again. This time it was an incoming call from Mark. He did not usually call twice unless he had already uncovered something. I answered, bracing myself without knowing why. His voice was sharper now, fully awake, the professional version of him that had replaced the groggy one from earlier. He said he had checked the insurance database. Nothing about a cardiac procedure. No admission, no discharge. Not even a coded consultation. There was no claim number, because there had been no claim. I closed my eyes and let the silence sit between us. He continued talking, giving details in the same steady tone he probably used when delivering unwelcome findings to attorneys. He had tracked the transfer path of the $34,000. The money had gone into a secondary account linked to my dad's existing checking account, then out again 2 days later as a full cash withdrawal. No hospital had ever touched it. No medical provider had billed for it. The story about the emergency heart procedure had been fabricated. I felt something in my chest tighten. Not like shock, more like recognition. Something familiar but unwelcome. He said there was more. He had also found small transfers from my contributions toward the mortgage being rerouted to the same account. They were spaced subtle enough to avoid immediate detection unless someone went looking. He said he was still digging, but everything pointed toward deliberate misuse rather than a misunderstanding or clerical error. I heard my voice come out steady when I thanked him. I was not sure how I managed that. When we hung up, I leaned back against the car seat and stared at the lake. A few ducks drifted near the far edge. Somewhere a dog barked. Everything around me moved the way it always had, steady and indifferent, while the life I thought I had been part of shifted under my feet in ways I had not prepared for. If the surgery had been a lie, then the urgency attached to it had been a manipulation. My dad had told me he needed the money immediately, that the hospital would not proceed without payment. I had wired it over within minutes because the idea of losing him had terrified me. Now that moment replayed in my memory with new clarity. Not fear, not urgency, but calculation. I unlocked my phone and scrolled through old messages. There it was, a text from my dad sent late in the evening about the hospital demanding payment by morning. At the time, it sounded like he was under pressure. Looking at it now, the message felt rehearsed. No mention of the hospital name, no doctor, no appointment time. Just a vague statement meant to prompt immediate action. I had fallen for it because I trusted him. Trust is a kind of currency, and I had spent mine freely. I sat there for a long while before forcing myself to move again. I needed more confirmation, not just from Mark, but from the institutions themselves. The insurance company placed me on hold for several minutes. The kind of bland instrumental music drifting through the receiver like a reminder of how ordinary this process was for them. When someone finally answered, I repeated the phrasing Mark had given me. The representative confirmed that no payment had been made under my transfer funds, no case file existed, and no request had come from any provider. She apologized for the delay in pulling the information. I thanked her, even though none of this was her fault. By the time I ended the call, my stomach had settled into a cold knot. It was not fear. It was understanding. Something had been constructed around me for years, and I had mistaken it for love. I turned the key in the ignition but did not drive away. Not yet. I needed a few more minutes to steady myself before facing the next set of truths. My phone buzzed again. This time it was the bank. The representative said they were calling regarding the mortgage account. I swallowed hard and asked what the issue was. She said the last 3 payments were marked as overdue. I felt my breath catch. I explained that I had transferred money just as I always had. She said she could see the incoming transfers, but the funds had been moved to another internal account and the mortgage had not been paid. She apologized again for the confusion and said she could send documentation showing the internal movement of funds. I thanked her, trying to keep my voice even. When the call ended, I sat there gripping the steering wheel. 3 months. 3 entire payments. I had been transferring the money faithfully, believing I was supporting the house, supporting the family, supporting a future that apparently never included me. 3 months. It was such a large window of time, and yet I had seen none of it. Because I never questioned. Because I never asked for proof. Because they knew I would not. I put the car in drive and pulled out of the lot, not sure where I was headed. I ended up in another parking lot, this one near a laundromat that had been there since I was a kid. I remembered waiting in the car while my mom washed bedding during spring cleaning. The windows cracked open so I could listen to the sound of traffic. Now I sat in the same place as an adult, trying to make sense of how a life could fold in on itself without warning. A message from a neighbor popped up. He asked if everything was all right and added that he had seen my brother's car in the morning, the driveway, almost every night for the past few weeks. He mentioned overhearing him talking loudly about settling old debts and turning things around. That phrase made something click. Old debts. I knew about some of his troubles, minor things, petty scams he always blamed on friends. My parents had always shielded him, insisting he needed time to grow up. I had believed them. Now I wondered if he had been involved in more serious financial problems. Maybe the lies about my dad's health were not just about getting money from me. Maybe they were about covering for him. I drove to a quiet side street and parked again. It felt like every few minutes another piece of truth dropped into place, forming a picture I wished I could look away from. I opened social media and searched for my brother's name. A few posts from acquaintances mentioned that he had disappeared for a few months last year. Another post hinted that he owed someone money, but would not say how much. Someone mentioned a casino. I felt that cold knot tighten again. I leaned back in the seat and closed my eyes. For years I had made myself small so they could feel bigger. Useful. Needed. I had paid bills, covered emergencies, rearranged my life to stabilize theirs. Everything they asked for, I provided. Now I was beginning to see that those requests had not been random. They had been steps, quiet, incremental steps towards shifting responsibility onto me. And then, when I no longer served their purpose, they had removed me as easily as closing a door. My phone buzzed once more. A message from Mark. He wrote that the withdrawals matched patterns he had seen in fraud cases before. He mentioned that the money might have been used to clear high-interest debts or to settle obligations that could not be traced easily. He also wrote that he believed my dad was the primary architect of the scheme, with my brother acting as a convenient funnel. He said the signs pointed not toward a moment of desperation, but toward a pattern of financial dependence they had built on me without my knowledge. I did not plan the timing. That part still surprises me. I made one call because clarity had finally replaced fear, and clarity likes paperwork. It does not care about family dynamics or childhood photographs or the way someone once held your hand at a funeral. It cares about facts. So I provided facts, one after another, and the investigator on the other end told me what would happen next. I nodded even though he could not see me. My hands were steady. That surprised me. The 45-minute window did not feel long. It was barely enough time for me to drive to the end of our old street and park in the shadow of a maple tree that had been there since before I moved in at 8 o'clock, years old. I kept the engine off. I kept my breathing even. I watched the house without letting myself feel anything more than a slow burn in, the space behind my ribs. The porch light was on even though it was still early evening. My mom always turned the lights on too early, worried the neighbors would think the house looked abandoned. That thought slipped into my mind without invitation, a habit that had been programmed into me long before I understood what program it was. At exactly the 45th minute, a patrol car turned onto the street. It was quiet. No siren. Just the glide of tires over asphalt. My pulse did not speed up. The calm that had been growing inside me since the insurance call settled deeper into my spine. I watched the car roll to a stop, in front of the house. The two officers stepped out and approached the porch with the kind of purposeful neutrality that comes from seeing every kind of family in every kind of crisis. I stayed in my car, far enough to avoid being pulled into the scene, close enough to witness what I needed to witness. I told myself I was only observing, but the truth was that I wanted to see my dad's face. I wanted to see the moment he realized the story had shifted, and he was no longer the narrator. My dad opened the door. He always opened doors with confidence, as if every threshold belonged to him. He had that same posture now. Straight shoulders, lifted chin, polite smile ready for use. The officers introduced themselves and asked to speak with him. He stepped back to let them inside. I saw my mom appear behind him, wiping her hands on a dish towel even though she had not cooked dinner in years. My brother appeared next. He leaned against the wall in that exaggerated way he used when trying to look relaxed. I could almost hear him asking, "What now?" with that smirk he used whenever he felt immune to consequences. It was strange how predictable their movements were, like watching a play I had seen too many times. The officers began talking. I could not hear the exact words from where I sat, but I recognized the cadence. It was the cadence of an investigation, not a wellness check. My dad's posture shifted slightly. His chin lowered a fraction. His hand tightened around the edge of the door. My mom's mouth fell open in a small O of confusion that would have been believable if I had not already seen her use it with neighbors whenever she wanted sympathy. My brother pointed toward the yard, toward the street, toward nothing in particular, and then back at the officers, as if he could redirect the conversation by sheer force of insistence. One of the officers shook his head slowly. My brother threw his hands up and stepped back. Angry now, his voice rising even though I could not hear the content. I watched him gesture wildly in the direction of my car, and for a moment I thought he had seen me, but he had not. He was pointing at no one. That was his way of dealing with fear. Blame the air around him until someone else inhaled it. My mom sat down on the steps, covering her mouth with both hands. She began crying, soft at first, then louder, the familiar wail I had grown up responding to. I felt nothing at the sound. Not guilt, not sorrow, not anger, just distance. The officers stepped inside the house. A few minutes passed. Then another car arrived, this one unmarked. An investigator stepped out, holding a clipboard and wearing the kind of expression that said he did not intend to be misled. He spoke briefly with the officers, then with my dad. That was when I saw it. The first crack. My dad tried to interrupt the investigator. He lifted his hand, not in aggression, but in that subtle, commanding gesture he always used when redirecting conversations. The investigator did not stop. He kept speaking, and my dad's hand slowly dropped. My mom cried harder. My brother paced in small circles like a caged animal. The investigator pulled out a document. My dad glanced at it and shook his head. The investigator pointed to something on the page and repeated a question, firm and direct. My dad hesitated. That alone would have been enough for me to understand the truth. My dad never hesitated. He always had an answer ready. This time he did not. The investigator asked another question. I could tell from the angle of his posture that it was about the medical claim. My dad's face changed. His lips pressed together. His chin trembled slightly. Not from sadness, but from the effort of maintaining control. That tremor told me more than any confession could. My brother started yelling then. Not words, just noise. He threw one hand toward the kitchen, toward the hallway, toward the stairs. He wanted someone to blame, someone to corner. My mom tried to calm him, but her voice cracked under the weight of the situation. I saw the officer nearest to him place a hand near his belt, a warning, not a threat. My brother backed up. It struck me then how familiar this scene felt, even though I had never witnessed anything like it. The dynamic was unchanged. My dad was trying to lead. My mom was trying to smooth the edges. My brother is trying to escape responsibility by pushing it onto the closest surface. The only difference now was that I was not inside the house. I was outside, watching. And this time, I was not the one explaining anything. The investigator spoke again. My dad began talking quickly, his hands moving the way they did when he was building a narrative. He pointed toward a stack of papers on the counter. The investigator shook his head and pointed again at the document in his hand. My dad's shoulders sagged. It was the moment he lost control of the story. I felt it like a shift in the air. For years, he had shaped the narrative of our family with precision. He decided who was reliable, who was emotional, who was helpful, who was burdensome. He had crafted roles for all of us, and we had played them because we believed we were part of something bigger than ourselves. But now the narrative had slipped from his hands and into the hands of someone who did not care about his scripts. My mom stood and tried to intervene. Wiping her eyes and stepping toward the investigator, she touched his arm lightly, a gesture she used often when trying to humanize herself. He stepped back politely and continued with his questions. I knew what he was asking because I had been the one to report it. Not the forged rent agreement, not the mortgage redirection, not my brother's debt trail, not even the false eviction. Those would surface in time. But the anchor of the case, the center of gravity, was insurance fraud. I had reported the non-existent heart surgery. It had been the cleanest line between fact and crime. No emotion embedded in it. No family history to cloud judgment. Just a simple truth. There was no procedure, but $34,000 had disappeared under the guise of one. The investigator had every document he needed, every timestamp, every transfer, and he had my statement. My brother must have realized then that the officers were not there for him. He pointed at the house, shouting something short and sharp. My mom shouted his name. My dad shouted his name louder. The investigator raised his voice to cut through the noise. Everyone went still. He asked my dad a question. My dad looked at the ground. He did not answer. That was the moment my mom's sobs changed. They became hollow, less frightened, more resigned. The sound of someone realizing the scaffolding of their life was not as solid as them, they thought. The officers walked my dad to the porch railing to continue the conversation away from the chaos. My brother leaned against the wall, breathing hard, glaring at the investigator as if glaring could rewind time. My mom sank onto the top step, her hands shaking. I exhaled slowly, letting the cold evening air settle into my lungs. I felt no triumph, no satisfaction, no vindication, only a recognition of inevitability. This was not revenge. Revenge requires intention. This was the consequence. Consequence is quieter, heavier. It does not arrive with fanfare. It arrives with paperwork and questions and undeniable facts. One of the officers turned toward the street as if sensing movement. I lowered myself deeper into the driver's seat. I did not want to be seen. Not yet. Not like this. I was not hiding. I simply needed the distance. The investigator closed his notebook. My dad rubbed his forehead with both hands. My brother kicked at a pebble on the porch. My mom whispered something to no one and everyone. The lights inside the house cast long shadows across the yard. It struck me how artificial the brightness looked. For years, I had thought that house glowed with warmth. Now it looked like a stage set. Props, painted walls, costumes, roles assigned, not chosen. My phone buzzed. A message from Mark. He wrote one line. They have enough to proceed. I stayed parked under the maple tree for several minutes, watching as the officers continued their work. It was not dramatic. It was procedural. That was the part that broke the illusion most clearly. The story unfolding inside that house was not a family tragedy. It was an investigation. And somewhere inside myself, I accepted that the story I had been told my whole life was already gone. What remained now were facts, the kind that could not be undone by tears, or apologies, or the familiar weight of someone's hand on your shoulder. I took one last look at the porch, the doorway, the silhouettes of the people who had shaped my childhood. Then I started the engine. The sound was soft, steady, unremarkable, but it carried the quiet certainty of something irreversible. As I pulled away from the curb, I did not look back. Not because I was done, but because the next part of the story had already begun, and I needed every ounce of strength for what came next. I drove back to the small apartment complex where I had been staying, parked near the stairwell, and sat in silence for a long moment before I forced myself out of the car. The night air felt cooler than it should have for early summer. Maybe that was just my body still adjusting to the adrenaline drop. I told myself to breathe normally, to walk normally, to act like everything happening was something I had trained for. In the ICU, we are taught to regulate our emotional responses. The body reacts. The mind steadies. At least, that is how it is supposed to work. But as I unlocked my apartment door and stepped inside, My phone vibrated. It was an email from the hospital. My breath tightened before I even opened it. The subject line alone made my stomach drop. Mandatory meeting regarding internal review. I stood there in the dark living room, shoes still on, bag still over my shoulder, rereading the subject line as if it might rearrange itself into something harmless. It did not. I finally clicked it. The message was short. Administration had been contacted regarding an insurance investigation linked to a patient claim involving my name. They needed to speak with me the next morning. No details, no reassurance. Just a time and a room number. I sat down slowly on the floor because my legs were suddenly unreliable. I had known this was possible. Mark had warned me. Anytime medical fraud touched a provider's name, even peripherally, the institution had to protect itself. It did not matter that I was the one who reported the fraud. All they saw at first was a nurse connected to a questionable claim. I pressed my palms against the floorboards, grounding myself. I told myself facts. The claim was false. I had not submitted anything. I had not signed anything. I had not participated in anything. The money never went to any hospital. But facts do not soften the fear of losing a career that took years of training, and nights of exhaustion and holidays spent in scrubs while the rest of the world slept or celebrated. I leaned my head back against the couch and let my eyes close. I had not cried earlier when my dad told me to leave. I had not cried when the officers walked into that house. But now the pressure behind my eyes sharpened. It was not grief this time. It was fear. Then, just as quickly, something steadier moved in. Fear had company. Anger. Not the explosive kind, the quiet, measured kind that sits like a stone in the center of your chest. I stood up and forced myself to prepare for the next day. Clothes laid out, badge clipped to my bag. Documents placed beside my keys. Copies of the insurance statements printed. Everything is organized. That was something I could control. When the sun rose, I felt like I had not slept at all. I walked into the hospital through the side entrance and made my way to the FAT administrative wing. The hall smelled of coffee and copier toner. Familiar but unwelcome that morning. A woman from HR met me at the door and guided me into a conference room where 2 administrators and a compliance officer were already seated. They greeted me politely. Almost too politely, in that careful tone people use when they have not decided whether you are a witness or a suspect. I sat across from them and folded my hands to keep them still. The compliance officer began by explaining that a medical insurance provider had raised questions about a claim associated with my dad's supposed procedure. They wanted to verify my involvement, or lack of it. Hearing the words spoken aloud inside hospital walls made something inside me twist. It felt like my professional world and my personal world had collided in a way I had worked my entire adult life to prevent. I explained everything. The text messages my dad had sent asking for money. The urgency he described. The $34,000 that vanished. My belief at the time that he had been treated at an out-of-network location. The complete lack of documentation on his end. The moment I discovered the truth. The report I filed. I did not exaggerate. I did not dramatize. I spoke the way I speak when giving a patient handoff. Clear, specific, factual. They listened without interrupting. When I finished, the room stayed silent for a beat too long. The compliance officer finally asked if I had ever accessed or submitted any clinical information related to my dad's alleged condition. I told him no. He asked if I had ever used my credentials to support or verify anything related to the claim. Again, no. He asked if I had ever participated in or benefited from any part of the alleged fraud. No. And that was the truth. He wrote notes carefully. The HR representative asked whether I felt pressured by my family to provide medical support beyond my scope. That question hit unexpectedly. Pressure. The word felt too small. Pressure is something you feel when someone wants you to pick up an extra shift. Pressure is someone asking for a ride to the airport at 5 in the morning. What I had lived under was not pressure. It was an obligation built layer by layer over decades. Still, I answered honestly. Yes, I felt pressured. Not professionally, personally. They nodded. They thanked me. They told me the review would continue, but at this time, there was no indication of wrongdoing on my part. It was a relief I could not fully absorb yet. As I stepped out of the conference room into the hallway where residents hurried past with clipboards and nurses discussed morning labs, I felt strangely detached. For a moment, I could see myself at 15 again, walking these same halls when my mom had real cancer. I had spent entire afternoons sitting in waiting rooms doing homework while she slept through treatment. I remembered holding her hand when she told me she did not want me to be scared. She promised I would always have a home, no matter what happened to her. She spoke so gently then, voice thin but warm, and I believed every word, because she had been the first person to make me feel chosen. It was surreal now, remembering that version of her, the one who stroked my hair when I cried after my first day of high school, the one who hung my acceptance letter to nursing school on the fridge and called everyone she knew to tell them she was proud. I had wanted to keep that version of her alive in my mind, preserved like a photograph. But reality had pulled her forward into someone else, someone who watched me carry the weight of the family finances and let me believe it was love. As I walked back toward the ICU, Mark called. I stepped into the stairwell to answer. He asked how the meeting went. I told him the truth. He let out a slow breath of relief, but reminded me that investigations like this could take time. I thanked him for everything he had done. He asked the question he had been hesitant to ask since the beginning. Are you sure you want to keep going with this report? I understood why he asked. Dropping the report could make my life quieter. It could shorten the internal review. It could spare me from months of being side-eyed by administration while they waited for full clearance. It could help restore my reputation faster. It might even protect my family from deeper legal trouble. I leaned against the wall, feeling the cool cement against my shoulder. The thought of dropping the report made my chest tighten in a different way. A younger version of me would have done it. The 8-year-old who wanted to be kept. The 15-year-old who wanted to be seen. The 23-year-old who thought being valuable meant being used. But not now, not after everything I had uncovered, not after watching my dad lie without hesitation, not after seeing my mom choose convenience over truth, not after realizing my brother had used my money to pay off debts I did not know existed, and not after standing in that cold spot on the porch while being told I was no longer family because I was not blood. I told Mark I was not retracting anything. If the investigation touched me, I would deal with it. If there were consequences, I would face them. But I was done protecting people who had never protected me. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he respected that. When I hung up, my hands were steady again. The clarity had returned. I walked through the unit to begin my shift. The familiar rhythm of beeping monitors and soft footsteps and the quiet hum of ventilators surrounded me. For a moment, the normalcy grounded me. The work made sense. The work was honest. The work had rules. Families, however, did not. During my lunch break, I sat in the staff lounge staring at the beige wall while eating a granola bar from the vending machine. One of the newer nurses, Hannah, sat beside me. She looked nervous. She finally said she had heard something about me being called into administration. Rumors travel fast in hospitals. I nodded but kept my tone even. It is fine. Just a procedure. She studied my face like she wanted to believe me, but could tell I was tired. She asked if I needed anything. I said no. The truth was that what I needed could not be given in a staff lounge. What I needed was the sense that someone in my family had once meant what they said. After my shift ended, I drove home and found a voicemail from my mom. Her voice sounded strained. She said the investigator had asked questions she did not understand. She said she felt betrayed. She asked why I was doing this to them. Then she paused, and her voice softened into something almost pleading. She asked me to come home and talk. I sat on the edge of my bed listening to her words loop through the room. The guilt tried to surface. It always did. But then a different memory surfaced. 15 again. Sitting in her hospital room while she slept through chemo. The way I watched her chest rise and fall. The way I prayed for her to live, and the promise she made when she woke up. You will always be my daughter, no matter what. But I was not her daughter when it mattered to her, not when money entered the equation, Not when bloodlines became weapons. Not when I needed her to choose truth over convenience. I lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling. I did not cry. I did not feel numb either. Just aware. Aware that the investigation was not only about them anymore. It was about me, too. How I answered. How I stood my ground. How I proved that I was not the one who had crossed the line. By the time the sun dipped behind the buildings, I knew the next call I needed to make, so I sat up in bed, pulled my laptop toward me, and opened the folder where I kept every document I had scanned over the years. Tax forms, receipts, emails from mortgage companies, bank transfers, text message screenshots. I had collected these things for practical reasons at first. Then I began collecting them because something in me had always sensed the instability under the surface. Not dangerous, just uncertainty. The kind that makes you document things so you cannot be told later that your memory is wrong. I called my lawyer Daniel early the next morning. He answered on the second ring with a voice that sounded like it had already reviewed 3 cases before breakfast. I gave him the summary. He did not sound surprised. He had met my family exactly once, during a small dispute years ago, when my dad insisted a repairman had overcharged us. He had seen enough that day to understand their dynamic without needing translations. He asked me to send scans of anything connected to the house. I pulled everything into a single folder and sent it. Mortgage statements, deeds, old emails between my mom and a contractor, photos of the roof that I had paid $18,000 to fix. I sent things that felt irrelevant too, because sometimes irrelevant things become keys when someone with legal training sees the pattern. 2 hours later, he called me back, and the first words out of his mouth made my stomach drop. He told me there was a will I had never seen. A will from my grandmother, my mom's mother. The woman who had lived in that house before my parents did. The woman who had held my hand when I was 8 and too small to understand death, or adoption, or permanence. She had always smelled like lavender and peppermint. She used to press a piece of chocolate into my palm every time I visited, whispering that life should contain small sweetnesses even when things felt heavy. I had not known she wrote a will before she died. Daniel kept his voice steady as he explained. The original will leave the house equally to my mom and to me. 50% each. My grandmother had listed me by name, acknowledged me as her granddaughter, not adopted granddaughter, not an unofficial family. Granddaughter. She had written it when I was only 9 years old. My chest tightened as he read that part aloud. But then he told me the next part. My dad had filed a petition years later to execute an updated version of the will. This update removed my name entirely. The explanation he provided at the time was that my grandmother, according to him, had intended the property to remain in the bloodline. The update was signed under circumstances that the court never challenged because no one contested it. Not my mom, not me. I had been too young to even know such a thing existed. For the first time in a long time, I felt something deeper than anger, something heavier, a sense of displacement so old it reached back into childhood and wrapped itself around my ribs. I asked Daniel if the updated will was valid. He paused long enough that I knew the answer was complicated. When he finally spoke, he told me he had questions about its authenticity, signatures that did not match previous documents, a witness who could not be located, dates that were curiously aligned with my grandmother's hospitalization, when she would have been heavily medicated. He said it quietly, but the implication was not quiet at all. There was a real possibility that my dad had altered more than just family expectations. He may have altered legal documents too. My mind drifted to my mom. I wondered if she knew. I wondered if she had convinced herself it was harmless. I wondered if she had ever opened that will and read the part where her own mother wrote my name with clear intent. Daniel continued speaking, laying out the options. If the original will was valid, I still retained legal claim to half the house. If the update was fraudulent, I retained more than a claim. I retained legal standing to challenge everything that had followed. Property, financial shifts, eviction. Suddenly, the story I had been living was not just personal betrayal. It was something far more concrete, something that lived inside court records and notarized statements. I thanked him and told him to keep going. He promised he would. After the call, I walked to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water. My hand shook just enough that I had to place the glass down before attempting a sip. The sunlight through the blinds cut the room into strips of brightness and shadow, and for a moment I felt like I was standing inside the image of my childhood, half illuminated, half concealed. The next call came that afternoon. My brother. I let it ring twice because my first instinct was to ignore it. Then I answered because part of me was curious what role he believed he still played. He did not say hello. He asked why I was doing this to the family. His voice was sharp, defensive, almost theatrical in its attempt to sound wounded. I told him I did not have time for manipulation. He laughed, but the laugh cracked. He said he knew about the investigation and that I could stop it. All I had to do was retract the report. He said it would save my parents. It would save him. It would save me, too. Then he made the mistake of threatening me. He said people were talking. He said rumors could ruin a nurse's reputation quickly. He said that if I kept pushing, the blame might fall on me. There is a particular kind of confidence that comes from having nothing left to lose. My voice was steady when I asked him a simple question. Who told you I had something to lose? He went silent. That silence was more satisfying than any insult I could have hurled. I told him I knew about the debts. I knew about the false rent agreement. I knew about the insurance fraud. I knew about the house and the will. And I knew he had been using the address to start businesses that never existed. I felt him inhale sharply, the kind of inhale that belongs to someone who thought he was the only one holding cards. He told me I would regret this. I told him I had already regretted enough for one lifetime. Then I hung up. My phone rang again almost immediately. This time it was Mom. I stared at the screen, unsure whether to answer. Eventually I did, because avoiding her would only prolong the inevitable. Her voice was soft at first. She said she had heard things. She said my brother told her I was dangerous now. She said my dad was exhausted. She said the family was falling apart. I waited for her to ask about me. She did not. Instead, she asked me to stop. She said the house belonged to her son. She said I needed to stop being dramatic. She said this was not the time for stubbornness. I felt something inside me shift, like the final thread of a rope snapping. I asked her one question. Did you know about the will? There was a long pause. Not confusion, recognition. She knew. She had known for years. When she finally spoke, she said something small, almost whispered. She said she did not want to disappoint my dad, that he had strong opinions about inheritance, that he believed things should stay in the bloodline, that it was easier to agree with him than to fight. The words hit me harder than anything my dad had ever said, because love is not always loud. Sometimes love reveals itself in absence, in the choice not to protect, not to defend, not to question. I thanked her for her honesty, even though I felt anything but grateful. I ended the call because I could not breathe through the feeling expanding inside my chest. Later that evening, Daniel called again. His tone was different this time. Focused. Measured. Confidence. He told me he had looked deeper into the records. There were irregularities in the updated will that warranted a formal challenge. He said I had legal standing to claim my 50%. He said this shifted the entire balance of power. House, eviction, mortgage, everything tilted. I stood by the window, watching cars pass on the road below. I thought about myself at 8 years old, stepping into that house believing permanence was something others bestowed upon you. I thought about myself at 32, standing outside the same house while someone told me I was not blood. Two truths. Both are painful. One outdated. I realized then that the house had always been the symbol, not because of the property itself, but because of what it represented. Belonging, security, identity. Now it represents something else. Choice. I could walk away from all of it. Let them keep the house. Let them keep their story. Or I could step forward and claim what had been mine all along. Not for the sake of bricks and wood, but for the sake of truth. I asked Daniel what it would look like to challenge the will. He explained the process. It would not be quick. It would not be clean. But it would be just. And justice, I was learning, is not always loud. Sometimes it is a quiet recalibration of balance. I told him to proceed. He said he would file in the morning. After the call, I sat down on the edge of my bed. The room felt still, almost suspended, like breath held before exhaling. For years, I had been the child grateful for scraps of affection. The teenager is trying to earn her place. The adult paid $96,000 to prove her usefulness. Now the roles were shifting. For the first time, they were the ones scrambling. They were the ones losing control of the narrative. They were the ones facing consequences. And I was the one choosing what happened next. I lay back against the pillow, letting the weight of that truth settle. It did not feel like victory. It felt like alignment. A quiet return to something I had not known I lost. Tomorrow, the formal process will begin. But tonight, for the first time in years, I felt the ground beneath me hold steady. I let myself breathe into that stillness, knowing the next storm was coming, and I would meet it standing. The morning after Daniel filed the challenge, I woke earlier than usual. Not because of anxiety, but because my body finally understood that something irreversible was already in motion. It was not fear or anticipation that got me out of bed. It was an unfamiliar steadiness, a kind of internal alignment I had not felt since childhood, before I learned how effort and affection could be weaponized in the same breath. I made coffee, sat by the window, and watched the neighborhood slowly come alive. Children waiting for buses, a man walking his dog, a woman in a robe dragging her trash bin to the curb. Life continued, indifferent to the fractures forming inside my family. And that indifference felt strangely comforting. It reminded me that consequences, unlike people, do not negotiate. By the time the sun reached its highest point, the first official notice had gone out. My dad was being charged with insurance fraud. A federal investigator notified Daniel that a formal statement would follow within 48 hours. The charge carried mandatory restitution and a potential sentence, though first-time offenders sometimes received probation if the fraud amount fell below specific thresholds. $34,000 was not a small number, but according to the investigator, it was also not the largest case on his desk. Still, the weight of it rested heavily on me. I thought about the moment my dad looked down at the porch, unable to answer a simple question about his supposed heart surgery. For the first time in my life, he had not had a script ready, and now the consequences of that silence were taking shape. I wondered whether he had slept at all, whether he had convinced himself he still had control, whether he had constructed a new narrative in which he was the victim of misunderstanding. Later that afternoon, my mom called. I let it go to voicemail. Her voice cracked as she asked me to return her call. She said the investigator had come back to the house with more questions. She said my dad looked pale. She said she wished things had not gone this far. I sat there listening to her voice, feeling the familiar tug of guilt. But something held me steady this time. Maybe it was the memory of her admitting she had known about the updated will. Maybe it was the finality of the eviction. Or maybe it was the realization that she had chosen convenience over truth for so long that she no longer recognized the difference. I did not call her back. Around 5 that evening, I received a text from a neighbor near my parents' house. She had seen 2 unmarked cars parked outside. She sent a picture. The image showed my dad sitting on the porch steps, shoulders hunched, hands clasped between his knees. My mom sat beside him, her face hidden in her hands. My brother stood near the railing, pacing back and forth, talking to someone on his phone. I stared at the image for a long time, not with satisfaction, and not with sympathy. Just with clarity. Actions have consequences, and consequences do not care about intentions. The next day, Daniel called to explain the official charges. My dad was being held liable for knowingly submitting false information to obtain medical payout funds. The insurer was demanding full restitution of the $34,000 plus penalties. The state was pursuing probation with mandatory financial oversight. He would lose the right to manage any family assets. He would be required to attend financial responsibility courses. He would be monitored for a minimum of 18 months. My mom, according to the investigator, would not face jail time, but the report noted her involvement. Her signature on forms she never verified. Her agreement to let my dad handle everything without checking facts. It was not criminal liability. It was documented negligence. She cried, Daniel said. Not because she was innocent, because she expected a softer outcome. And then there was my brother. His probation officer revoked his bond. The investigation into his side businesses, which had quietly begun months earlier, accelerated after the insurance fraud case revealed a pattern. He was told to remain in the state for questioning, but within 72 hours, he was gone. Daniel received word that he had crossed into another state where one of his old cat friends lived. The investigator called it predictable. People with revolving debt histories rarely wait around to explain themselves. Part of me wondered if he believed I had caused all of this. Another part of me knew he believed that. He was raised in a household where blame landed on the weakest branch. Until now. Later that week, Daniel and I met in his office to go through the formal response from the probate court. The judge had reviewed the challenge to my grandmother's will and found enough evidence to proceed. That meant a hearing would be scheduled. That meant the house, legally, was partially mine. 50%. The number looked strange on the form. Too clean. Too balanced. Too certain for something that had felt so uncertain for so long. Daniel explained what my options were. I could fight for full restoration of the original will. I could negotiate for settlement. I could claim my half and force a sale. Or, if I wanted, I could keep my portion and become partial owner of the house. He watched my expression carefully as he listed each option. I told him I did not want the house. Not because I did not have a right to it. I did. Not because I wanted to spare my parents. I did not. But because that house had never belonged to me. Not in the way that mattered. Even when I lived there, I had walked on eggshells. I had measured my worth in chores completed, bills paid, sacrifices made. The walls of that house held every version of me, except the one who knew she deserved stability without conditions. I asked him what happened next if I chose to sell my portion. He explained that the court could order a partition sale, requiring the property to be sold and the proceeds divided according to ownership. It was a clean solution. It would also force my parents to face the financial consequences of their choices. He asked if I was certain. I said yes. When I left his office, the sky was shifting from blue to deep violet, in between spaces where the world felt suspended for a few minutes. I walked slowly to my car, letting the cool air settle around me. I thought about the night I had been told to leave, the porch light, the suitcase, the moment my dad said I was not blood, the way my mom looked past me instead of at me. I do not feel anger now. I felt distant. Not emptiness, just distance. A clean, measured separation that allowed me to see things without the distortion of hope. 2 days later, the consequences became real for them. My dad called me. His voice sounded older, thinner, almost unfamiliar. He said the restitution amount was due within a specified time frame. He said he would be required to attend hearings. He said he needed help. I listened, quiet. He had not said my name, not once. He asked me if I could speak to the investigator and explained that he never intended harm. He said families make mistakes, that it had all been a misunderstanding, that he was trying to provide for everyone in his own way. I waited until he finished. Then I asked him a question I had waited decades to ask. When you told me to leave the house with my suitcase, what was your intention? There was silence. A long silence. Then he said he had been upset, that he had felt pressured, that he believed I would understand. I thanked him for the call. I told him the investigator would contact him again with instructions. Then I ended the call. He called back twice. I did not answer. My mom tried next. Her voice cracked as she said things had escalated too far. She said my brother had packed what little he had left and fled. She said the house felt cold. She said she missed me. She said she wanted her family back. I leaned against my kitchen counter and closed my eyes. I remembered the version of her who had held me during chemo treatments and told me I would always belong. And I remembered the version of her who had stood behind my dad on the porch, silent, as he pushed me out. I told her a simple truth. I said I was not the one who broke the family. I had only stopped pretending it was whole. She cried. I listened, not because I felt obligated, because I was strong enough now to listen without absorbing. The hearing for the property came quickly. My dad arrived looking gaunt. My mom held a stack of papers in a trembling hand. Daniel presented the evidence clearly. The judge reviewed everything. Then she ruled that the original will held legal weight and that I retained 50% ownership. After the ruling, my dad looked at me with something like disbelief. My mom whispered something to him. My brother was not present. I did not ask where he was. Within 30 days, the sale process began. The house would be listed. The proceeds would be divided. Daniel offered to negotiate on my behalf, but I told him I did not want to extend the ordeal. I signed the necessary documents quickly. My dad asked me one more time if I could intervene on his behalf. Not for the house, for the fraud charge. I looked at him and said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. He had created this. He had chosen each step, and consequences, as I kept learning, do not care about intentions. When the sale was finalized, the funds were transferred into my account, half of the property value, a number I never expected to see on my bank statement, a number that did not feel like a reward, just an outcome. My parents moved into a smaller rental on the other side of town. My mom sent me a message saying it felt temporary and sad. My dad did not contact me again. My brother vanished into whichever state he had chosen to hide in. Friends asked me whether I felt triumphant. I did not. Triumph is loud. What I felt was quiet, measured, grounded, a sense that balance had been restored. Not because someone forced it, but because the truth had finally been allowed to stand on its own legs. On the night the wire from the property sale cleared, I sat on my balcony with a blanket around my shoulders. The sky was clear. The air was cool. For the first time in years, I felt something begin to settle inside me. Not closure. Closure is too neat. More like a recalibration, a resetting of weight. I understood then that justice is not about punishment. It is about alignment. And alignment does not heal you. It frees you to heal yourself. I rested my head against the back of the chair, let out a slow breath, and allowed myself to imagine what life might look like without the constant tug of obligation. It was a quiet picture, a steady one, and as the night deepened, I realized that the next steps were mine alone to define. 18 months later, the light in my apartment looks different than the light I grew up with, softer somehow. Warmer in a way that has nothing to do with bulbs or paint colors. I noticed it the first morning I woke up here, and I still notice it now as I stand by the window, holding a mug of coffee in both hands. The air smells like cinnamon from the candle I keep lit on the counter. I am learning to like small comforts. It used to feel indulgent. Now it just feels normal. My apartment sits on the 3rd floor of a quiet building in Charlotte. From my balcony, I can see the tops of oak trees and the roof line of a grocery store. It is not glamorous, but it is mine. My name is the only one on the lease. My mail comes without tension. My keys fit every lock in my life now. I changed my last name 8 months ago. Not out of anger, out of alignment. I chose my birth mother's last name after finding a photograph of her tucked in an envelope, her old box my grandmother had given me years earlier. In the photograph, she is standing in a field wearing a denim jacket, smiling like she believed life would be long. Seeing that picture again felt like an invitation, so I accepted it. The apartment walls hold 2 framed photographs. One shows my birth mother. The other shows my mom from the early years, back when she still hugged me like I was hers. When I hung the second photograph, I surprised myself. I thought I would want to erase everything. But the truth is more complicated. Pain does not cancel out the moments that were real. She did love me once. I believe that. I no longer live inside the wreckage of what came after. I keep both photos together, not touching, not far apart, just honest. My days are simple now. I still work in the ICU, but I went down to 4 shifts instead of 5. I started volunteering at a community clinic twice a month. I walk after work. I cook more. I sleep better. I learned that rest is not something you earn. It is something you protect. People sometimes ask whether I miss my family. It is a strange question. Missing implies an empty space shaped like someone else. What I feel is different. It is more like a healed scar. I can touch it without flinching, but I remember what created it, and that memory keeps me steady. My dad never reached out after the sentencing. His probation ended 2 months ago, but I heard through Daniel that he is still under financial supervision. He lost access to every account he used to control. I thought I might feel vindicated hearing that, but I mostly felt neutral. Truth stripped away his authority. Nothing more, nothing less. My mom sent one letter last winter, 4 handwritten pages apologizing without ever using the word sorry. She circled around it gently. She said she wished she had been stronger. She said she wished she had pushed back against my dad sooner. She said she hoped I was healthy and safe. At the bottom, she wrote, "You will always be a part of my heart, even if I did not act like it." I keep the letter in a drawer. Not because I am waiting for reconciliation, because parts of it are sincere, and sincerity deserves to be kept, even when the relationship it comes from does not. My brother resurfaced months ago in another state. He sent me a message asking if I could loan him money to get back on his feet. The request was so familiar it almost felt nostalgic. But nostalgia is dangerous when it is tied to a wound. I declined, politely, clearly, firmly. He has not written again. Sometimes I think about the house, not often, just in passing. The way you think about a place you once lived without realizing how temporary it is, actually was. The new owners repainted the door. They planted hydrangeas along the walkway. They removed the old porch swing that had been there since my grandmother lived there. When I drove by once, on my way home from a clinic shift, I felt no pull, no sting, no longing. It was just a building I had once mistaken for permanence. The truth is that I did not lose a family. I stopped chasing one. There is a kind of peace that arrives only when you finally understand that belonging is not something you buy with labor or money or silence. It is something that grows where honesty is allowed. And if honesty cannot live in a particular space, then neither can you. A few nights ago, I sat on my balcony under a blanket, watching the lights from the parking lot flicker against the trees. It was quiet except for a dog barking somewhere in the distance. I found myself thinking about the girl I used to be, the one who bent herself into shapes that never quite fit, all for the chance to be chosen. I wanted to reach back through time and tell her she was already enough. I think about boundaries too, how they are so often misunderstood as aggression or rejection. But boundaries do not end relationships. They reveal the truth about them. The people who love you adjust. The people who use you break. My boundaries did not break my family. They ended the part of it built on my silence. These days, I measure closeness differently. I let people in slowly, not out of fear, but out of intention. My life feels smaller in the best way, spacious where it matters, steady in ways I never imagined. On weekend, I visit a little coffee shop near Dilworth and sit by the window with a book. I like watching people pass by. I like feeling part of a world that does not ask me to carry more than my share. Every so often, someone will laugh or drop a bag or spill a drink, and the sound reminds me that life can be ordinary and still be good. I am still healing. Healing is not a finish line. It is the season. Some days are heavier than others, but the heaviness no longer comes from trying to earn love. It comes from remembering how long I did. Tonight, as I sit on the floor sorting through a box of old things I never unpacked, I find a crumpled grocery list written in my grandmother's handwriting. Bread, apples, peppermints. There is a small heart in the corner of the page. She used to draw them for me. I smooth the paper out and feel something warm settle in my chest. I keep that moment. I let the rest go. This apartment may not look like much to anyone else, but it feels like a place where the ground finally stopped moving. A place where I do not need to over-explain or apologize for existing. A place where love is something I give freely instead of something I negotiate for. And if there is one thing I hold on to more than anything, it is this. Boundaries did not make me lose a family. Boundaries made me realize I had the right to one that would not harm me. I close the box, turn off the lamp, and take one last look at the photographs on the wall. One mother who gave me life. One mother who gave me a home for a while. Both chapters in a story I am finally able to tell without shaking. If you have ever been told you were too much or not enough for your own family, remember this. Silence can be power. And truth can be the loudest revenge. Tell me in the comments what integrity means to you and where you are listening from.